So in 2023, forecasts called for strong prices for the cattle industry, both for the fed and the feeders. However, with high feed costs and the impacts of the drought on the prairies, cow-calf and feedlot margins were pressured. So to get a sense if the outlook for 2024 is any different, let me now introduce Des Sobel, Deputy Chief Economist at FCC. Hi, Des.
Hi, Darlene.
So, Des, what do you foresee for the cattle sector in 2024?
Well, I'd just like to call out, though, in 2023, yes, we actually did forecast those record prices that we did see. So that was good news for the sector. So we had really strong prices. But when you look at it regionally, we did see that in Eastern Canada, there were good margins. They had adequate moisture. Then in some areas, they actually had a little bit too much rain, precipitation. But overall, the profit margins were good in Eastern Canada. When you flip to the west, though, this is where we ran into the drought issues. And so, the areas that were impacted by drought, they had feed availability concerns, feed cost concerns. And so we actually did see some of those margins were pressured. Feedlots were actually forced to import corn from the US. And so that added additional cost. And so as we see right now, even in southern Alberta, hay prices are roughly double what they were in the in 2020. So, it's been a concern for the sector. The drought had a huge impact on profitability. The one good thing that's happened so far this year, or kind of late last year and this year, was actually the lack of snow. And so we have seen that the lack of snow has allowed some cow producers put their cattle on stubble. So they are actually able to save some feed costs there. So that's actually been beneficial for the sector as well. So if you look at this next slide on the screen here, what we're seeing for 2024 is that prices did start to decline at the end of 2023 from the record highs, and we're seeing those stabilize right now. So our forecast for 2024 is actually really strong cattle prices. This will support margins, and we're seeing this will continue on through the year and actually might increase in the latter half of the year. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is if you look at the chart, you can actually see that our cattle herd has been declining. And so this started in early 2000s. So with the outbreak of BSE, we saw there was a contraction in the cattle herd, and that's been declining. So actually where we're at right now is we're at a 3-decade low in the beef herd, and our replacement heifers are near all-time low. And so that's really putting some strain on the inventory levels. And you can see from that our cattle herd, because of BSE, has shrunk by 30% since the early 2000s. So overall, given strong cattle prices, feed costs that are starting to moderate, we're actually seeing profitability in 2024 that's going to be fairly good, not as high as 2023, but still above our historical average.
So let's go back to the inventory question. I've been thinking about that, and I'm wondering if in the beef sector, given the long-term contraction that's been happening in the herd in cattle, what do you expect for producers? Is there a possibility to grow that herd size back?
That's a great question. So herd expansion is something that's top of mind. So on the figure you'll see here, this is both Canada and the US. So this shows the number of cows and heifers that are sent to slaughter. And so we're actually at a decade high. So about 51% of cows and heifers are being sent to slaughter, which means those aren't being retained to build the inventory. So even with those strong price signals that we're seeing in the market, we're still seeing a lot of cattle being sent to slaughter. And so the rebuilding of the herd is going to take time. And so one of the challenges is that, especially in Western Canada, we've had a drought 2 of the last 3 summers. So this has really caused sentiment in the industry to be low. And so we've actually seen producer sentiment in 2021 has reached a low. It's only started to rebuild. And so that sentiment is something that needs to turn around for producers. We need to have timely rain. We need to have good precipitation this summer. And as JP alluded to earlier, when you look at Canada, across Canada, 81% of there's a moisture deficit. In the prairies, it's 81%. And so, 100% in the prairies. So, that's a challenge. And so that's going to weigh on producers. So that herd is going to rebuilding is going to take time. The sentiment needs to increase. And if you look back into 2015 and 16, when there was actually some strong price signals to rebuild the herd, they ended up staying flat. So the rebuilding is going to take time. It's not something that's going to be solved relatively quickly.
So, Des, if we look at the cattle market, we really know that it's a North American market, right? So What's happening right now south of the border, and what's on the radar that Canadian producers should be really looking for? What's happening down south?
So when we look at the U.S., we've actually seen the Southern Plains region, which includes the Texas heartland, has had numerous years of drought. And so that's been ongoing there. So their cattle herd has been contracting as well. In 2023, it actually did improve. The drought conditions did improve. But even despite that, we saw a 3% decline in their cattle inventory as of July of last summer. So, and the overall cattle herd in the U.S. now sits at the lowest level since 2014, with the cow herd being the lowest on record. So what it's really saying is ultimately, herds in both countries are going to be struggle to rebuild. So in the short term, there's still strong prices, so producers have incentive to sell cattle to get them slaughtered. And the cost of retaining heifers is actually quite expensive. So, going forward, it's going to be a multi-year process. We're seeing strong prices through 2024 and even into 2025. As producers start to rebuild herd, it's actually going to limit supply that'll go to slaughter as well.
That's interesting. And Christian mentioned earlier that inflation and food prices are really top of concern for the Canadian consumer. And how does that impact at the grocery store for the beef sector moving forward?
Yeah, so food inflation is widespread and beef is no concern. As Christian mentioned, household budgets are being constrained, consumer spending is being reduced. And so this is changing behaviors of consumers as they tighten their belts. So what we've seen in the last year is actually beef consumption has gone down. So as the affordability of pork has improved relative to beef, we've actually seen consumers shift their consumption away from beef and consuming more pork. So this is something that's not surprising given the high prices that have been faced. But from some of our research that we've done, we actually know that the demand for beef is really strong. So consumers, they like beef. They have a preference for it. And so once inflation starts to come down a little bit more, once food inflation starts subsiding, we will likely see that transition back to consumers eating more beef. I think the challenge, and I alluded to it earlier, is that there's going to be strong prices for all of 2024 and into 2025. So it likely will be retail prices will still be higher than average for beef. And so that might take some time for that consumption pattern to start to change.